Good morning to you. I greet you in the name of the Lord. I guess a shalom would be in good order at this particular point. Thank you so much for being here today. We're very pleased for each one that has chosen to spend part of their Saturday at this conference. And to those of you who are watching around the world, thank you for tuning in today. And among those watching are my children and their families, and I'm especially pleased about that. I want to say thank you to the Lamb and Lion staff for everything they've done in order to prepare this August assembly, and particularly Rachel. I think she is the lady that was the ramrod. Don't ever cross her. I want to thank Dave personally for the invitation and for all those who had part in putting this together. I have been asked to speak about the rebirth of Israel. And I want to read just a couple verses from the book of Ezekiel, chapter 36. Ezekiel is one of the greatest prophets in the Bible, great in that what he said, what he wrote, has a direct application to what is going on in the world today. And these are some words that he penned by inspiration of the Holy Spirit regarding the nation of Israel. God said through Ezekiel, "It's not for your sake." And boy, aren't you glad of that? "It's not for your sake, O house of Israel, that I'm about to act, but for my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations where you went. For I will take you from the nations." He's not talking about Babylon and Assyria. He says the nations. "I will take you from the nations, gather you from all the lands, and bring you into your own land. And you will live in the land that I gave to your forefathers, so that you will be my people, and I will be your God." And I see no suspense date on that. The longer I study Bible prophecy and the longer I'm involved in writing and speaking, the more astounded I am at the body of meaning associated with the rebirth of Israel. The more I learn to appreciate what it means, and the more I learn to appreciate its fullness regarding the church, you and me, and where we are today. Folks, I believe that as a theme we could say it this way: no event in modern history is buried so deeply in the mountain of discarded occurrences on the timeline of human history by the secular world, and so ignored so brazenly by the modern organized church as the May 14th, 1948 rebirth of the eternal God-ordained nation of Israel. There are people in pulpits and people in pews across the land, across the world, who wish that day had never happened. At the same time, I also believe that there is no event in modern history that is so critical to the understanding of world history, whether you go back to the book of Genesis or you go into eternity in the future, in the book of Revelation. No event is so critical to the understanding of those things and the understanding of the nature and being of God Himself than the rebirth of the nation of Israel. And for those of us who are Christians, I believe there is nothing that has happened in the last 2,000 years that is more encouraging to our faith and more persuasive regarding our premillennial, pre-tribulational convictions as the rebirth of Israel. Take out the rebirth of Israel, and I'm going to question a whole lot of things. But God saw fit to bring those people back into their own land in May of 1948. And for those who centuries before that time said it's going to happen, I tip my hat of faith to them. I don't know if I could have been that strong. There are several ways this presentation could be presented. And I have chosen one that's a little bit different than the way it's been presented, at least from my perspective, in the past. I want to talk about the necessity of Israel. I see nothing in the Bible about the necessity of England or America, but I see much in the Bible regarding the necessity of the nation of Israel. I want to talk about Israel's national death. And when I say national death, I'm not talking about the death of Jewish people. I'm talking about the death of the nation of Israel. I want to talk about the returns. Two distinct kinds of returns to the land. And then I want to focus a little bit on the purpose of that second return, and then I want to build it all with an exposition on those texts having to do with the rebirth of Israel in 1948. First, the necessity. When you get to Genesis chapter 11, you find that the human race was in a shambles for the second time. The first time was in Genesis chapter 6 with Noah. We don't know a whole lot of details about what happened in those first 5 chapters. But we do know that the human race, as we would say today, was in the toilet. Things were just going from bad to worse. There were things happening that we today have difficulty understanding, having to do with the sons of God and the daughters of men and that kind of thing. But we do know that everything was bad. In fact, God looked around at this thing and he said, this is so bad, what I'm going to do is I'm going to wipe this thing out. Except for 8 people. And you know the story of Noah. The exact same situation occurred in Genesis chapter 11. In 5 chapters, in a few short centuries of time, the human race had gone from 8 people that survived the wrath of God to a world that was about to face it once again. And God looks around at this thing at the Tower of Babel and he says, what's the matter with you people? When the ark settled on the mountains of Ararat, God told Noah, he said, look, I want you to leave this thing. I want you to go around the world. I want you to populate the world. I want you to be the caretaker. I want you to be the steward of everything that I've created. And life is going to be good for you. You can even eat steak now. But what did they do? They went right back to where it all started, in the land of Shinar. I mean, they all got together and they went back in that fertile valley, this alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and they went right back to where it began. And then when they got there, they said, I tell you what, God, we don't need you anymore. What we're going to do is we're going to do this thing on our own, and we're going to build a tower. You got that, huh, God? We're going to build a tower as a memorial to our intellectual and our mental prowess, and we don't need you anymore. Does that sound familiar? Have you ever heard anybody of late say, we don't need you anymore, God? You need to get out of our courtrooms, and you need to get out of our classrooms, and you need to get out of our boardrooms, and you just need to just dispossess yourself, God. We don't need you. And God looked down at this thing, and he said, look at this, all over again. So God had some choices. He could destroy what was left by water. And that wasn't really a choice because he said earlier, I'm not going to do that again. Or he could maybe destroy it by another means, maybe a plague or, whatever. But he didn't do that. As Genesis 11 ends and Genesis 12 begins, you see that God comes up with something even better. He couldn't go back and just destroy them and start over again like he did under Noah, because the human race was incapable of sustaining any kind of righteousness. The human race, because of the Adamic nature, was in the toilet and it would stay there. God could have sent 1,000 Noahs and all of that kind of thing. It would have gone right back to the Tower of Babel. The human race can't make it on its own. And I don't care what your kids are being taught in sociology and psychology classes, even in some Christian universities. The human race does not have the ability to sustain itself on any kind of moral level whatsoever. There was only one means, and God had already talked about it in Genesis chapter 3. He said, I'm going to send somebody that's going to be born of the seed of woman. Now, right there, you come to a full stop and you say, seed of woman? That ain't what I learned in 8th grade biology. That ain't how it works. The guy has the seed, and you know what I mean. Kids learn that really early these days. God said it's going to be the seed of... Why did he do that? Why did he say in Genesis chapter 3, I'm going to send what we would call today the Messiah or the Savior? He says, I'm going to send this person, and he's going to be born of the seed of woman. And the reason is this: he could not be born of the seed of man because it's through man that we normally have seed, and it's through man that we normally inherit the Adamic nature from our forefather Adam. The one that he would send had to be both God and man. He got his humanity from his mama, and he got his godhood from the Holy Spirit. And we have the God-man without coming from the seed of man, therefore without the Adamic nature. A Messiah, a Savior, must do what no one else could do. And that Messiah and that Savior could not come from the Gentile world. They were incestuously inbred with rebellion. A new nation had to be formed, one free from man's past. And a special man of faith must be found to start that new nation. And there is where God cast his eyes upon the world, and he found this little area down there in a place called Ur, the area of Chaldea, modern Iraq. And he looked around at those people, and he saw one guy named Abram, and he said, he's the man. You know, in my fantasies, I conjure up conversations with God, you know, when we get there. I got lots of questions. And I want to know, because Abram, to a degree, was an idolater. God, what did you see in Abram that you didn't tell us through Moses? What is it about Abram? I don't know. I just have a lot of questions about that. But he saw somebody different in the person of Abram. And he chose Abram. He said, Abram, I want you to leave your mom and your daddy and all your friends, your partners and everything. I want you to go to, where am I going to go? I'll tell you later. Takes a lot of faith. Last time I did that was in 1968 when I raised my hand and enlisted the U.S. Army. They said, we're going to send you somewhere. I said, where? They said, we'll tell you later. Actually, I have to tell you, that's not exactly true. I'm going to chase a rabbit for just a minute. I was a young 18-year-old, and I got tired of school. I graduated high school, went to school, and I got tired of school, and I said, there's nothing happening in this one horse town. I'm going to see me some action. And Vietnam was really, really the active place in those days. So I walked in this Army recruiter's office, and Sergeant First Class Dick Lawrence was sitting there behind that big old desk and everything. I said, I want to know two things. I said, can you guarantee me, and there are no guarantees in the Army, can you guarantee me that I can get military intelligence? And I bet he thought, military intelligence for this guy? Can you guarantee me that I can get into military intelligence? And secondly, can you guarantee me that I get to go to Vietnam? He kind of had one of those 1,000-yard stares. And he kind of connected eyeball to eyeball with me. And he leaned back in that big old black fake leather chair, and he put his hands behind his head, and he said, son, he said, you drive a hard bargain, but I think I can help you. It wasn't like that with Abram. God said, I'm going to send you somewhere, and I'm not telling you where it is. He didn't even tell Abram what he was going to do. But it was through Abram that he founded this new nation. He produced a nation, a tribe, and a family, and a house from which would come Messiah. Because there was no nation and no tribe and no family or no house in the Gentile world that qualified. So when you look at it, there was a tremendous necessity regarding Israel. Israel was God's tool in dealing with inherent sin, a tool that he could not have in the Gentile world. It had to be through Abram. Problem of sin was foreknown in the mind of God. I mean, before he created this thing, he knew what was going to go down. There's no doubt about it. Because he is omniscient. He knows everything before it happens. So in my mind, as he was putting this thing together, he looks across this vastness of nothing, and he sees creation. And he looks upon the billions of galaxies out there, and he settles on a little galaxy called the Milky Way. And inside that little galaxy called the Milky Way, he sees this little solar system that we call our solar system. Got a little old bitty sun and a bunch of little planets running around and that kind of thing. And of those planets, he settles on one little speck of cosmic dust that we call Earth. And he says, that is where I'm going to deal with the problem of sin, right there. Folks, it's not the size of something that makes it important. Ask Napoleon about Waterloo. Before Waterloo, nobody knew what, before Napoleon's defeat, nobody knew where Waterloo was. It's not the size of the town. It's the fact that this emperor was defeated. It's not the size of the speck of cosmic dust. It's because of what happened here. This is where the great God of heaven dealt with the problem of sin. And it was on that little speck of cosmic dust that he saw this place and this man. And he took that man from that place and put him in another place, and from there built this nation that we call Israel. I want you to understand something. Without Israel, God is still God. But without Israel, there is no mercy, and there is no grace, and there is no salvation, and there is no coming vindication when God says, take that. Something that we look forward to also. And without Israel, there is no purpose in life and no reason for living and no hope. All these people that say, oh, God's finished with Israel, finished with the Jews. Oh, we just sweep them under the carpet of history and everything is going to be okay. God bless the church. Jesus died for his bride. I'm part of it. You're part of it. Yes, and 1,000 amens. But without Israel, there would be no church. God made no mistake in creating this new nation, Israel. And the church would be spot on biblical to not make the mistake of thinking Israel no longer has a place in God's plan for the human race. That's a necessity. Let's take a look at their national death. In order to have a rebirth, in order to have what I would call a resurrection, you have to have a death. As Jesus commanded Lazarus to come out, not only from the tomb itself, but from the cold, dark regions of death, so he also said for Israel to come out from her centuries-old grave in the hostile Gentile world and from a similar cold, dark region of national death. Look at Ezekiel 37, and you see it clearly. Now, regarding the rebirth of Israel, there is some confusion and error at this point that exists in the organized church. I say organized, and that's not a slam or anything like that. It's just that I like to think of myself as a Christian. I don't like to think of myself as an ite or an ist or something like that. Just call me Christian. That's all I want to be known as. I want to be known as a disciple of Jesus Christ. That's all I need. That's all I need. So when I say organized church, I'm talking about some of these things that have their own, if you want to be this particular ist or this particular ite, then this is the list of rules that you got to believe this, and you got to believe that, you got to believe this other thing. I don't buy into that kind of thing. Where I go to church, I don't agree with everything they say, and when I say they, I'm talking about either the preacher, the Sunday school teacher, or the guy sitting next over, in the next pew or something like that. I'm me. I am not responsible to some human tribunal. I'm responsible to God. I live for an audience of one. So when I say the organized church, I'm talking about that kind of liturgical. Can you see me with a robe? I don't do robes. It's hard enough to do a tie. But there's some confusion in the organized church about this thing about Israel. And if people had a real good understanding of Deuteronomy 28, it's a very important key. I mean, a lot of this stuff would clear up. There are two dispossessions of Israel in Deuteronomy 28. There's the first one that speaks of them going into exile under their kings, and that happened in Assyria and Babylon. And then there is a second one, the last part of Deuteronomy 28, that has reference to a worldwide dispersion, a worldwide dispossession from their land, and there is no king associated with it. Bill Salus points this out clearly in one of his books. If people could kind of get this thing kind of squared away, it would begin to remove some of the cobwebs and the fog about this thing about Israel and their rebirth. Another thing that clears it up would be a real good understanding of Ezekiel 37. The dry bones resurrection, or the dry bones rebirth of Israel, is connected to a worldwide dispersion from AD 70, then AD 35, when a bunch of the rest of them were kicked out of their land and scattered around the world. But Ezekiel 37 has nothing to do with this Assyria and Babylon dispersion. It's got nothing to do with it. People talk about got the lost 10 tribes of Israel that went into Assyria. They're not lost. At the birth of Jesus, a couple people were identified. Was it Anna that was from the tribe of Asher? They're not, and if you and I can't figure it out, God's got it, I promise you. The return that we see here, this rebirth that we see here, is a return from all the world. A return to the land of Israel, your own land in in Ezekiel 37, verses 12 through 14. Verse 9, he said to me, prophesy to the breath. Prophesy to the breath? To the breath. Back in another profession I had, people had to prophesy to their breath, and usually I put handcuffs on them afterwards. Where'd that come from? Prophesy to the breath, prophesy, son of man, say to it, this is what the Lord God says, breath, come from the four winds, not from Assyria and not from Babylon where they were sent. Come from the four winds and breathe into these slain so that they may live. Brethren, when you go to Ezekiel 37 and look at this thing about the death of national Israel in the valley of dry bones and that kind of thing, this is not the resurrection of all dead. This is not a general resurrection of any kind. I don't know of a general resurrection except for the lost. And that's separate and apart from our resurrection. This is not a resurrection of all dead. It's not even the dead, get this clearly, this is not even the dead of Israel. This is the resurrection of the nationally dead nation of Israel. These aren't some Jews that are going to be resurrected. This is an entire nation. And once that is clear, once that comes into focus, and the rest of this stuff kind of starts being cleared up a little bit. And there's something else that helps further the clarification of this thing. And it has to do with covenants. One of the mistakes that we make is that we associate covenant with will, W-I-L-L. I'm talking about, you draw up a will in case you die before the Lord comes. There's some truth to that, but it doesn't exactly fit perfectly. And I'm not going to chase that rabbit, but just understand this. There are two kinds of covenants in the Bible that God used with humanity and with Israel. There are conditional covenants, and there are unconditional covenants. A conditional covenant would be the Mosaic covenant. The law on Sinai. God says, if you do this, then I'm going to do that. And if you don't do this, what I'm telling you to do, I'm not going to do that I promised to do. Those are conditional. Kind of like when you deal with your kids. Y'all know what I'm talking about. Then there are the unconditional covenants. One of the first unconditional covenants made was not with Israel, but was with the entire world. Remember what God said after the flood? He said, I am never, ever, that's Southern for never, ever. I am never, ever going to destroy this world again with water. It doesn't matter what the human race does. It doesn't matter what the human race does not do. Nothing matters about nothing. The fact is, God is never going to destroy this world with water again. And those of us who challenge us on our convictions in this matter will say, the only unconditional covenant you want to talk about is this thing with Abraham over in Genesis 15. No, it's not. God said he's not going to destroy. That's still working. I mean, you get a little thunder shower and look out there, the first thing you see is a rainbow. And every time you see a rainbow, God is putting another exclamation point. I ain't going to destroy it with water again. And every time you look at that rainbow, you can say, God is never going to destroy the world with water again. And then there's another unconditional covenant, and it's called the Abrahamic covenant, part of which we find in Genesis chapter 15. God said, I'm going to give you this land from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates River, and all you got to do is run down those groups that he mentioned there, and you will see that they lived on the Euphrates River. God said, I'm going to do it. He didn't say, Abraham, if you do this, then I'm going to do that. He said, kind of like with the water thing, Abraham, I'm going to do this. And just as the rainbow is present tense right now, today, a guarantee that he will never, ever destroy the world with water again, so is the rebirth of Israel the present day, right now guarantee that that land belongs to them. There are those who would say, oh, wait a minute, Don. Wait a minute here. Well, you got Joshua 21:43. You know what it says there? It says that God gave them all the land that promised to the fathers and all that kind of thing. Listen, I'm not going to chase this. We're going to put this in a book form later this year at CSM. But if you look at Joshua 21:43, what is being recorded there is in the context of Numbers 34. It's the land that was given to the fathers, not the patriarchs, to the fathers and their families that went into the land under the conquest, during the conquest by Joshua. Look at the borders that are mentioned. You will see they are not the same borders as those that God mentioned or gave to Abraham in Genesis 15. Context is everything, folks. Any text out of context is a pretext, as Dr. Olford used to say. So this Joshua 21:43, we can talk about it some other time, but I just wanted to kind of throw that. I won't charge you anything for that. Just keep that in mind. Deuteronomy 28 has both kinds of covenants found in this text, the conditional and the unconditional. And the unconditional covenant has to do with their dispersion around the world and their return from around the world to their own land in the latter days, as Daniel said. I believe there are several reasons the church as a whole refuses to accept these two distinct places of Israel and the church in God's plan. That is commonly called dispensational theology, and you're probably very familiar with that. But one of the major ones is that the church will not even, I'm talking about the collective church, the church will not even consider, much less accept the distinctions between these covenants. You start talking about distinctions, they start talking about the weather or something. I don't want to talk about that. The inevitable result is that people are kept locked up in a world of confusion about the present and fear about the future. If you get some theologian or some preacher or some Sunday school teacher who gives his class this kind of stuff and never distinguishes between these covenants, and that the return of Jesus, the return of Israel is a rebirth and it's from all around the world, then people are going to sit there, they're going to read what, well, the last part of Deuteronomy says this, but the teacher says that, and this is confusing. Yeah, I guess it is confusing. Some of that confusion could be due to people's own lack of study. I'll bet you $1 to a donut, and I love donut. I'll bet you, the people in this audience today and the people who are watching this around the world, have a pretty good understanding of this stuff. That would be my guess. Or else you probably wouldn't be here. But I can also tell you that the overwhelming majority of people who sit on pews on Sunday mornings are simply there to warm a few square inches of pew cushion, throw a few bucks in the plate, and do some whatever it is that they do. Go home, get out their little pencil, and okay, God, I can check that one off. I was there this morning. That's about the way it goes. And if you take this, folks, if you take these scriptures and you hold it up for them in a class, and I've been there and many of you have too, in a class where people didn't understand, it was at a liturgical church not long ago, and started talking about these people, and he just looked at it kind of like a hog looking at a wristwatch. He didn't have a clue what you were talking about. Sometimes I believe this could be due to the misunderstanding, purposeful or maybe not purposeful, of some synod, some convention, denomination, or brotherhood. You know, well, the brotherhood believes this, and the brotherhood, I don't give a rip what the brotherhood says. But that's, they put all this, their ability to go to sleep at night and rest peacefully, or their inability to rest peacefully, they put in the hands of the brotherhood. It just doesn't make sense to me. Or sometimes these things could be the result of an honest mistake in the study of Scripture. But brethren, and I'm not going to chase this too far, but I want you to get this. It is my personal conviction that there is confusion and darkness and fear and misunderstanding about all of this thing about the unconditional covenants and return of Israel to their land in the latter days, simply because it's a satanically inspired influence upon anti-Semitism. For God to have voided the Abrahamic covenant and to have gone back to dealing with humanity through the Gentile world would make him an impulsive God whose word and promises and covenants would be worthless. You want to serve a God like that? It would make the prophetic scriptures, it would make 1/3 of the Bible when it was written a bogus and essentially cruel fairy tale deceptively embedded in what would allegedly be called the inspired body of truth. How can you have a body of truth that's inspired if 1/3 of it is deception? It won't happen. And I believe also it would make the Noahic flood and the scattering of humanity from Babel nothing more than a temper tantrum of a despotic and careless God. Perish the thought. Remember, and this is critical, remember the Gentiles are grafted into the root stock of Israel, not vice versa. And every 8th grade science student understands that grafting requires a living root stock. You can graft till the cows come home. If it's a dead tree, you ain't getting squat. Also remember that if God is to keep his promises to the Gentiles and to the church, then according to Romans 11, the rebirth or the resurrection of the nation of Israel is absolutely essential. Now, what about the preservation of the Jews all during his time? It was scattered in AD 70 and AD 135 and all around the world and all that kind of thing. Well, if Ezekiel 36 and some other scriptures were going to be correct in that he was going to one day bring them back to their own land, then in some kind of way, God had to spare them for these 2,000 years. You know, he scattered them and he said, but I'm going to bring you back. But in the meantime, he got to take care of them. How in the world did he do that? If there's going to be a resurrection, there must be the conservation of some entity that can be resurrected. That preservation, folks, was directly by the hand of God. Very similar, might I add, to the preservation of the root of the Hebrew language. The new state of Israel. And God foresaw this. He knew that the new state of Israel would have to be distinctive in every aspect of her rebirth and her character. And the rebirth of the human language would be part of that distinction. Can you imagine Israel speaking Arabic or English or French? Cajun French? Manoshka. And he used a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda. And now, if you just say, well, yeah, he used Ben Yehuda to do this, you know, against fierce opposition. He rebirthed the Hebrew language. We know something about that stuff. But if you just say that without looking at it carefully, you're going to miss something so very, very important, at least in my opinion. Ben Yehuda lived from 1858 to 1922. When was it that this modern Zionist movement began? Was it not the latter part of the 1800s, first part of the 1900s? Do you believe that the rebirth of the Hebrew language might have had something to do with God and Theodore Herzl and those guys? I think it definitely did. I do not believe that was a coincidence. Well, how did he preserve them? Well, first of all, the Jews cannot be annihilated. And boy, they have tried to. I mean, there are other ancient peoples that are gone. You don't see any Canaanites and Amalekites and Jebusites running around, do you? I had first time I went to Israel years ago, I was doing an archaeology kind of thing, you know, and they were using a Arab guide, and he was on the bus, and he was talking one day about he was a descendant of the Canaanites. I wanted to gag. No, and I do not say that disrespectfully. That is a lie that is being perpetrated, and not only is it being perpetrated in the Middle East, but it's been bought into by members who are the body of Christ. Those people are gone. They're in the dustbin of history, but not the Jew. Though there have been many attempts to annihilate them, none have succeeded. Whether you're talking about pogroms or attempted genocide, they've all failed. Why? Why has the Jew survived when the Canaanites didn't survive? I'll tell you why. And you can go to Exodus chapter 3 to see this. And the reason why is because God's in the nation like God was in the bush. Moses was out there. Moses thought he was a top dog leader. I mean, he was the most educated man that ever lived. He spent 40 years, you know, in the Pharaoh's court. He knew people who knew people. You know, he knew the man that sat next to the man and all that. He was educated with the princes of the world. You know, he was somebody. He thought he could lead people. And you know what happened? You know, he killed the Egyptian, and then he had to leave town. And 40 years, God took him and put him on the backside of the wilderness. You got to shepherd sheep before you can shepherd people. You know about that? He was out there one day messing around with sheep, and boy, they stink. Ha! And he saw a bush burning. And he stopped and he went over there to look at it. Now, he didn't go look at it because it was burning, because a bush burning in the Sinai is not a really unusual thing. Because of the way things are, the bushes get very, very dry in that arid region, and the crystals and the rocks and the sand and everything can cause spontaneous combustion. Remember when you were a kid, you'd take a magnifying glass and you would focus the light, burn an ant, you know, write your name, that kind of thing. It's that kind of thing. The sun beats down on the sand and it reflects back and all that kind of thing. So the fact that it was burning was not that unusual. He turned around and he looked at it because not only was it burning, it wasn't being destroyed. That's what made him turn around and look at this thing. It's the same reason that Israel has survived. They cannot be annihilated. They can't be burned up. God's in the nation. How do you burn up something with God in it? Can't do it. Think about this. God told Abram, he said, you have your son, your only son. Now, remember he had fathered Ishmael? Genesis chapter 22, long after Ishmael was born, God said, I want you to take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, your only son. Ishmael was an illegitimate child birthed by a concubine. So let's get that straight. He said, I want you to take your son and I want you to take him to Moriah and you sacrifice him. And you know the story about the ram caught in the thicket. Do you remember what God said after that? Think about this. He said, by myself I have sworn, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your only son, I will indeed bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sand of the seashore. Brethren, you can't make people that numerous if they are destroyed. God kept them. Secondly, not only can they not be annihilated, but they cannot be assimilated. And this is very important. This was God's call, intent from the beginning, from Abram. That's why God said to Abram, he said, I want you to leave, and I want you to go to a place I'm going to show you. He was taking him away from his environment so that he would be in a place where he could not be assimilated with anything associated with his past. He wanted something new. He wanted to build something from the very base root stock. So he had to get him out of there. You remember Isaac and where his wife came from? Did she come from the Canaanites? Did Jacob's wife come from the... No. You see, God did not want that. He did not want them marrying into the Canaanites because of the possibility of assimilation. He said, you can't do it. I don't want you having anything to do with them. There's a law in history called the law of assimilation. It works for everyone but the Jew. It was true from the start when Abraham's descendants went into Egypt. What did Pharaoh do? Where did he put them? He said, come on, y'all build a house next door. We're going to have this subdivision right here, right next to the... No, he sent them to Goshen. That's why they were told, when Pharaoh asked what you do for a living, tell them you're shepherds, because shepherds were loathsome in the eyes of the Egyptians. And so when the Hebrews hit the land, they took them and put them in Goshen. Get them away from us. Oh, they're Joseph's people, and we're going to take care of them, all that kind of, but get them, we don't want anything to do with them. That was all in the plan of God. God did not want them assimilated with the Egyptians. And he has not wanted them assimilated with us either. You cannot assimilate the Jew as a distinct race of people. Cannot be done. When people come to this country, within three generations, they are assimilated. My folks came from Drogheda, Ireland. Well, maybe I ought to say they got run out of Drogheda, Ireland. I don't know. Most of my ancestors were horse thieves and bootleggers. But a McGee married an O'Hara, and they had some sons, and they came to America. Well, within 3 generations, they were assimilated. I mean, I don't speak with the Irish brogue and all that kind. And I'm, not really crazy about green or potatoes or anything like that. So I would love to go to Ireland. I want to see one day, if the Lord tarries, I want to go see Ireland. But I don't want to immigrate there. My people are Americans like your people, quite probably. Won't happen with the Jew. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew. I don't care what generation he is. Jews have tried to be assimilated. They don't like this idea of sticking out like a sore thumb. They have a mistaken belief. If they could just blend in with everybody, they'd be accepted and all their troubles would be over. You know what it's all my hard times soon be over. No. You remember in the case over in 1 Samuel chapter 8, whenever people went to Samuel and said, we want a king. Why do you want a king? So we can be like everybody else. The Jews have been saying that since the time of David. They want to be like everybody else. Let me tell you something, folks. It's not going to happen. The Jews are never going to be like everybody else. God will keep them distinct because that is part of his plan. They see it as a liability. God sees it as an asset to the world. In the future, God is going to make this very clear, that the Jew is a blessing. You remember what Zechariah said? The Lord of hosts says it. What did the Lord of hosts say about this, Zechariah? Many peoples and strong nations will come and seek the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem and plead for the Lord's favor. The Lord of hosts says this, in those days 10 men from nations of every language will grab the robe of a Jewish man tightly, urging, let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. They're not going to assimilate. And to the world, to Ban Ki-moon, God has a message. Jews aren't going anywhere. Get used to it. Well, the rebirth itself. I believe that there have always been Jews in Israel. What called Israel for 2,000 years. They've always been there. Quite often there were very few, but there was always a presence. And if you look at their history, you look through the 8 periods of Jewish history between the return from the Babylonian exile until, well, the 20th century, you see that Jews have lived in the land. At least some have. And not only that, the reestablishment of their ancient homeland has always been in the collective heart of the Jewish people. Let's look at some factors quickly. Number one, first factor in the rebirth of the nation has to do with modern Zionism. To really get a handle on this, you have to go back to the 1890s and the treason trial of French Army Captain Alfred Dreyfus in Paris. Dreyfus was the armies of the world have these different colleges and things that you go to. You get master's degrees and you do all that kind of thing. They're advanced educations, and they teach you more than what you learn in your basic courses, officer basic course and that kind of thing. Dreyfus and some other Jewish officers, Dreyfus was an artillery officer, and he was in the French War College in 1892. And I believe it was a general that was running the operation. He didn't like Jews, so what he did is he orchestrated some things so that all the Jewish officers got low grades. Because he said they shouldn't be here, or some such thing as that. Well, Dreyfus was hated. And in 1894, somebody sold some artillery secrets to Germany. And he said, Dreyfus did it. He did it. It was an opportunity to pin something false upon this Jewish officer. Of course, later it was found to be a lie and he was reinstated. But it was a trigger point for modern Zionism. They had the trial. It was a secret court-martial, and he was quickly convicted. And there was a guy there named Theodor Herzl. He was an Austrian Jew, and he was a newspaper reporter, and he covered this trial. And while he was there, Herzl saw for the first time such virulent anti-Semitism in Paris. There were shouts of death to the Jews from the predominantly Roman Catholic anti-Dreyfusards. Interestingly, John Preston, in his review of the Dreyfus Affair, a book written by Piers Paul Reed, said, quote, almost 1/3 of all anti-Semitic books published in France between 1870 and 1894 were written by Catholic priests. I found that to be very interesting in my research. In 1896, Herzl published a book called The Jewish State because he saw the coming rebirth. And the reason he saw it is because he understood the persecution in the Gentile world would get to the point where they would have to leave. And he recommended, of course, Palestine as the place to go. Herzl said this, quote, Palestine is our unforgettable historic homeland. Let me repeat once more my opening words. The Jews who will it shall achieve their state. They shall live at last as free men on their own soil and in our own homes peacefully die. The world will be liberated by our freedom, enriched by our wealth, magnified by our greatness. And whatever we attempt there in Israel for our own benefit will redound mightily and beneficially to the good of all mankind, end quote. How accurate he wasn't even a prophet. But look what he said. And if you step back from this for just a second, and look at what the Jews contributed, there have been over 800 Nobel Prizes that have been awarded. At least 20% have been Jewish recipients, and I find that phenomenal since Jews make up less than 0.2% of the world's population. Y'all ever hear of Jonas Salk? Y'all ever hear of polio? Remember God's promise to Abraham. He said, in you, all families of the earth will be blessed. Second factor, the inexplicable allurement of the land. Gentiles, including the church, can't understand this. But there's a connection between the Jews and the land of Israel. They leave good jobs and money and established careers and family roots, and they immigrate to Israel, a place where there's physical and emotional demands that are made daily, surrounded by millions of Arab Muslims who hate them. Most of them hate them, at least. And the first thought each morning and the final thought each night are in context of base level survival from enemy attacks. And when you ask them, why do you want to do this? Why do you want to go back to this place? Because I don't know. It's just this thing I've got. You know, it's my home. There's a Jewish guy that was born and raised in Florida that works over there today. And some of you know him. And I asked him one time after I got to know him, I said, why'd you leave Florida and come over here to live in, and he said, it's my home. Your home? It's my home. He always welcomes pilgrims to Israel with these words, welcome home. He said that to me the first time. I thought, welcome. I'm not a Jew. I'm a Gentile Christian. Want my business card? You know, kind of thing. But I got to thinking about that, and I thought, one day, that's going to be our home. I think the man doesn't really understand what he's talking about there, but it's a great truth there. There's another factor as the condition of the land under the Arabs. God never intended for his land to be a wasteland, but buddy, it was. It was a viper and scorpion-infested region, no significant number of trees or agricultural efforts, low degree of health care standards. And Mark Twain went there in the 1860s and wrote a book in 1867 called The Innocents Abroad. He said, that place is a hellhole. It just sits in sackcloth and ashes. See, under Arab control, the land could never be what God intended it to be. Another factor is the condition of the land under the Israelis. They bought worthless land from the Arabs at highly inflated prices. They drained malaria-infested swamps, and they dug canals for irrigation and did a whole lot of things and made it into a virtual Garden of Eden. A fifth factor has to do with the world wars. World War I led to the land being made ready for the Jews, and World War II led the Jewish people being made ready for the land. Dr. John Phillips said one time, he said, it doesn't matter where a Jew is born and raised, he is still a Jew. And he told us about a man he knew on Haifa docks in 1948, a man named Cohen. And he was talking to Cohen, who was a survivor of Hitler's death camps. And he said, Cohen, tell me all about this kind of thing. He said, I will tell you this. He raised his hands. He said, I was a Jew, a German, but Hitler taught me I was a Jew. A Jew is a Jew, folks. I don't care what country issues his passport. He's a Jew. And Israel is his homeland. And God's bringing him back. Sixth factor is the cause of the allurement. It's something that you and I as Gentiles have difficulty understanding, but they go anyway. It's in their hearts. The seventh factor has to do with birth pains coming after the birth. May 14, 1948, Israel was born. The next day, they were invaded by 5 Arab armies, and they've been fighting for their survival ever since. What is the future? Well, let's look at this. Christians, our future is this. We're soon to leave this place. I wish the Lord would come today. I hate that drive back home. You can look for increasing persecution in the world, in the United States. It was said last night that we are seeing unprecedented persecution of the church in this country. Folks, we haven't seen anything yet. There's increasing cost for taking a scriptural stand with Israel, but also it offers increasing opportunities for encouragement and evangelism. What is the future for Israel? My belief as of today is this. I believe that they're going to experience another war of survival against the Islamic nations in near proximity to the rapture. That's my opinion. I believe that they're going to be involved with an agreement that's going to be brokered or offered by a Western political, economic, and military power that we often call Antichrist. I believe it could possibly be associated with their temple, or maybe even their association with the European Union. I look for the miraculous defeat of Gog and Magog, the coalition in Ezekiel 38 and 39, about the midpoint of the tribulation period, in my opinion. I look for unprecedented persecution for Antichrist. I believe in continual miraculous preservation by God. I believe that eventually they will experience national recognition and acceptance of Jesus as their Messiah. And I believe that we are going to see the inauguration of Israel as the preeminent nation in the world under the reign of Jesus Christ in Jerusalem. In closing, whatever happens to Israel and the Jewish people in the future, it's going to be directly related to the flagship day of our modern history, the day of her piece de resistance, if you will, the day of her modern political zenith. Whatever you want to call it, I don't care what you want to call it, but it's May 14, 1948, the day a most important Bible prophecy was fulfilled literally in a little old small room at Independence Hall on Rothschild's Boulevard in Tel Aviv. Samuel Katz said some things in his book, Battleground, Fact and Fantasy in Palestine. I'm not going to quote it all, but I'm going to give you this. In the Jew's home, he's talking about Jewish people in general, on family occasions, in his daily customs on weekdays and on Shabbat, when he said grace over meals, when he got married, when he built his house, when he said words of comfort to mourners, the context was always his exile, his hope, and his belief in the return to Zion and the reconstruction of his homeland. So intense was this sense of affinity that if the vicissitudes of exile, he could not envisage that restoration during his lifetime. It was a matter of faith that with the coming of the Messiah and the resurrection, he would be brought back to the land after his death, unquote. The rebirth of Israel. Let the Muslim world protest. Let the UN pass resolutions. Let the self-important modern demagogues rant. None of it matters. To paraphrase Yul Brynner in the Ten Commandments, as God has caused it to be written, so has God caused it to be done. Maranatha.